Welcome to the David Moskrop Show. You're never going to believe this, David Moskrop. One of these days, it's going to be someone else. There's going to be like, welcome to the David Moskrop Show, and it's going to be someone else. And it's going to blow everybody's mind, but not today. Today, it is me. I'm David Moskrop, and I'm here with a very special guest, Matthew Green, the incumbent and current candidate in Hamilton Center, a parliamentarian for a little while now, right? I mean, are you in
Dog
veteran
years.
territory yet?
It's dog years. I was
Dog
there through
years.
COVID, so that's like, at least worth 7 years every single year that we were in COVID, in my opinion, anyways.
Were you 2019? Was that your
I
first
was, yeah.
election? Okay, so you're pushing veteran status, right?
Feels like it.
That's three parliaments.
It's not even just three parliaments. It's COVID,
Mm.
convoy, right? Like it's
Yeah,
the whole thing. We've lived through it all.
yeah. So that's the dog years. It ages you fast.
That's what my hair's telling me, anyways.
You can tell that I live a soft life. I live a soft suburban life. Is that I stay out of the sun. So I'm well, although I was, I sort of lived through I was down the road from the convoy when it was there. Well, not pleasant. So you had to like walk through all that, right?
I stayed away. I don't think I would have gotten away with the Shawinigan handshake. So I kept my distance. I zoomed in. And I try to do my work from afar because I don't do well with that kind of confrontation. Admittedly, I'm from Hamilton. What can I say?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's talk about Hamilton. Let's talk about elbows up, if you will, and the work you're doing now, which is running for election in Hamilton Center. I want to start by zooming out, and then we'll zoom in. But at first, I want to talk about the NDP and the the value proposition that the party is making right now, because there was a shift in the messaging from the party, from the leader Jagmeet Singh is running for prime minister, to you've got to have NDP parliamentarians in the next parliament because we make it better. Now, full disclosure, I think that's objectively true. I really, really do. When you're on the doorstep now, when you're talking to the media, what's the value proposition you push for well, yourself, but more broadly the party?
Well, I think within the first 24 to 48 hours of this election, people were presupposing the outcome. They kind of fell into the presidential race trap of the United States of America, making it very binary. And the logic, I think people are settling out of, the logic was at the time that we need to reduce our multi party system to two parties in order to avoid the outcome of the American system with two parties. And so I think Canadians now, although there was probably an overcorrection to Carney in response to just how odious and despicable Polyev can be at times. Now people are recognizing that Canada works better in a Westminster system with multiple parties, particularly the NDP, to be the conscience of a country, to hold who's ever in power accountable, and to center working class people. We have two parties ultimately that are admittedly to the right. I think even Carney describes himself or is being described as a red Tory. And then you have the far right with Pierre Polyev. And I think Canadians recognize that there needs to be a working class value, one that centers everyday people at those discussions, in those debates, at committee, doing the work of Parliament, which is what we're proposing to do.
Yeah, I mean, on the Carney right wing thing, the journalist, I think Mark Bory, put it very, very interestingly off the top, was he would have been uh, comfortable, he could see Carney in a Brian Mulroney government, like as a cabinet minister in a Mulroney government. He does seem like, a center right figure of the 80s, 90s mold, right?
It's the reincarnation of Brian Mulroney. I have actually said those words. It's not always that Mr. Burry and I agree on things, but on that we certainly agree. The Overton window has shifted so far right, and there's a reactionary moment where the Liberal Party is finding or at least remembering its kind of Paul Martin years of a red Tory appeal to many conservatives in Ontario and Quebec who are rejecting Poilievre's very kind of divisive vision of nationalism. And like there's a certain gravitas that comes from being from Wall Street, that comes from being the governor of two banks, national banks of England and of Canada. And I think that there's a perception that he will be negotiating across the table with Trump. And I think it's our position that regardless of the negotiations that happen internationally, there still has to be democracy in Canada. There still has to be a parliamentary system, a House of Commons, a place where everyday people have their interests debated and met and ideas explored. And so that's the offering that we have here in Hamilton. Like, I don't pretend to know what the outcome is on the 28th. In fact, I think that's a dangerous thing to do. But what I do know is that Hamiltonians are asking for local representation, right? Like, the theory of the Westminster system was to elect amongst a community somebody to represent the local interest in parliament. But what party politics has become is Ottawa and the partisan message being represented from the capital to the community. And so here in Hamilton, that's being rejected. And we're getting lots of support here, despite what the national polls say.
Well, let's I mean, I think you're right about that, and I think it also has to do with the strengthening of the central leader's office over years. At every party level, but certainly in the PMO since the
Sure.
1960s, there's been a concentration of power. Parties have professionalized. There's been some academic work on this that says what's interesting is in the UK, you have short tenured prime ministers but long tenured parliamentarians, and in Canada, it's the opposite. And part of the reason why is that there's like 600 MPs in the United Kingdom, whereas in Canada there's now 343, and it's like you just can't control 600 people the way you can control half of that as leader. You don't have the sticks that you have and the carrots that you have in Canada, in the UK, and so you get these MPs who like are MPs and they hold their own party to account as well as the other party.
As it should be,
Yeah,
as
I
it
think
was
so too.
designed to be, right? Like, it was designed to have strong powers for backbenchers. That's why we have PMBs. That's why, the whip, as you identified, has been so concentrated that mavericks in Canadian politics only vote against their party, 3% of the time. And I don't think that's the way that our system was contemplated to work. I think it's a huge democratic decline in our ability to represent local interests. And I would put to people, like, imagine a politic where not only did parties have to negotiate with their members, but could, in theory, present compelling arguments to the opposition parties or to parties across the aisle that resonated on local issues that actually got pickup. Like, imagine if there was a partisanship approach to solving the country's problems rather than, as you identified, this really hyper concentration of power within the leader's office, where it's a gotcha politics that's really predicated on the wedge of the 8% on the first past the post that people try to flip. It incentivizes the worst behaviors, not
Hmm.
just in parliaments but in elections as well.
Yeah, I've been calling it this election Duverger's revenge because in the 50s there's a French sociologist, political scientist who hypothesizes that in first past the post systems like ours, you kind of get two party systems because the parties will kind of converge on the middle and try to win the most votes, and you get this. And for a long time that wasn't the case. Sometimes it was, but not often. But now it seems like in this election it might be. But that's actually a problem for our country because for the reasons you've identified. And I want to highlight the supply and confidence agreement and talk about it a little bit because I find this really complicated. I look at the supply and confidence agreement and say, look, the NDP made a bargain to support the Liberals in exchange for a handful of nice things. Things that I think could have been better, but were nonetheless really nice. Pharmacare, you get daycare, you get dental care, you get anti-scab law. What was it? Longer, was it days off? Was there a days off thing in
Sick
there too?
days,
Sick
10
days.
paid sick days, and there was also some support for, subsidizing people's cost of living. And yeah, like, I looked at that as a labor guy, much like you would a collective agreement. You don't necessarily have to be best friends with management across the table when you negotiate with them,
No.
but you
Shouldn't
do
be.
negotiate in
Shouldn't
good
be.
faith. What's that?
Shouldn't be. Right?
No, not at
Yeah.
all, not at
Yeah.
all. But, the point is that you make these negotiations to improve the quality of life for your membership.
Hmm.
I fundamentally believe that the 9,000 people in Hamilton who have access to dental care are better off in ways that a party of 25, as you identified at the time, it was obviously 338. Now it's 343. Like, we were punching way above our weight, and we did deliver. And in a cruel twist of fate, we're being punished for the Liberal track record with people who are saying, I can't support the NDP for supporting the Liberals, and so I'm going to vote Liberal. Like, there's a level of mental gymnastics that's very difficult to kind of unpack for some folks, whether it's online or at the doorsteps.
So was that foreseeable? Because I want to talk about the strategy of that a little bit because my best reading of that is the NDP agrees to this, and political electoral strategy aside, locks in a high probability of nice things. So that's a good move for substantive policy if we, put down our electoral strategy hats for a second. Now let's put it back on and ask, would you have been better off potentially going issue by issue on that? Could you still have got it? And or pulling the plug early? Because lots of people say, damn, they should have pulled the plug in October or November when the Liberals were weak, when Trudeau was locked in, and then the NDP would have been stronger. The flip side of that is you get a Tory government probably under those circumstances.
Supermajority.
So, so what do you make of all of that?
Well, there's the strategy and then there's the ethics. I
Yeah.
think we knew, I mean, you look at the science, the political science of this, the smaller party typically gets swallowed by the big one in these types of arrangements, whether they're confidence supply or in Europe where they actually have coalitions. We knew that was going to be a threat, but we also knew we had a chance to increase the universal public healthcare offering with pharmacare and dental care in a way that hadn't been contemplated for 60 years. That was a huge step, and we were willing to take the risk of being, not attributed for those wins, recognizing just how savvy, sometimes slippery as the Liberals are. But we made that conscious choice. I knew that when I supported the confidence supply agreement based on the political climate in Hamilton, that it might have been the case that I'm not reelected. And as a New Democrat, I have to be okay with that. In fact, I ran as a New Democrat knowing that I wasn't running to be in proximity to power. I was doing it to improve people's material conditions. And it is true. Strategically, we absolutely could have pulled the plug, not just in the fall, but after last March, when it became clear the Liberals were unwilling to, after all the lobbying of the pharma industry, actually delivered on the pharmacare project that we wanted to see in its full glory. We could have pulled the plug then. But I think by all accounts, that would have led to, yes, the collapse of the Liberal Party, but a conservative supermajority. And so, if our ethics say that we want to help improve people's material conditions, but we do something strategically that would undermine that in a significant way for potentially 4, if not more years, then we lose the ethics of the party. We lose being the conscience of the party. And we basically duplicate some of the worst and most cynical strategies of the people that we profess to be different than, i.e., the liberals and conservatives. And then, as it comes to the case by case, we did that in 2019 during COVID. We pushed for CERB. Liberals wanted to put in a $900 a month patchwork EI. We pushed for the $2,000 a month. We pushed to try to get supports for people living with disabilities and seniors at $2,200, a guaranteed basic livable income for folks. We even pushed for the supports for small businesses, right? We wanted the wage and rent supports. What we didn't contemplate was the liberal giveaway to big corporations
Yeah.
that took all that money and then laid people off anyways while paying off shareholders and CEOs. So we were sober when we went into the agreement. We knew, and Jagmeet knew what this could have meant for him in terms of getting swallowed up. But I don't think what anybody could have anticipated was this version of Donald Trump and him turning his attention with the kind of fascistic gaze that he's given Canada with annexation in the 51st state. That changed everything. Absent of that, even if Donald
Mhm.
Trump was just the bumpkin he was, I think Mark Carney would have been suffering the fate of Michael Ignatieff, and we would have been in a three-way race. But here we are.
Yeah, I've been saying this for a couple of days is I don't care which campaign you are, the Bloc campaign, the NDP campaign, the Conservative campaign. It's hard to game out a scenario in October, November, where you get Trump, threats of annexation, tariffs, Trudeau resigns because he gets shivved by Chrystia Freeland, Carney wins the Liberals leadership, and you have an election with no carbon tax. Like that was on zero people's radar, right?
No
No,
bingo cards held
yeah,
those
no,
happening.
no, exactly. It's like one of those people like, you had 5,000 people in the 20th century who had made predictions on when the Soviet Union would end, and one of them happened to be right because, of
Right.
course, if you're going to get lucky. But in this case, I don't even think one person had this, right? It was just
Well, I
like,
will say this. I mean, there's been multiple times where we probably could have put the nail in the coffin of the Liberal Party, but from an ethics position, decided not to. Uh, I never once counted out their ability to reemerge because they don't really have a moral center. They can be anything to anybody at any time, and I think that's where you see like the winds blow is where the liberals go, and now they're full set sail. So here we are. Um, but I don't think, as you say, anybody, despite how despicable and terrible Donald Trump is, could have anticipated the full fledged fascist
Mhm.
reemergence in his second term. Um, and the odd thing is that New Democrats are best positioned to fight fascism. We're best positioned to center the economy to work for working class people, so we don't have people feeling estranged and enraged because the economy is exploiting them. So those voices do matter. And in fact, I would argue that liberalism was the precondition under the Democrats for Donald Trump. And had they done more to come away from the elite way in which they treat their society in very paralleled ways, the Liberal Party with their elite kind of treatment of society, then we might not have this reactionary far right. Right. Like I think in a lot of ways they're symbiotic. Like I think Pierre Poilievre really needed Justin Trudeau in the way that Justin Trudeau really needed Pierre Poilievre, and likewise with Biden and Trump.
Yeah, there was a paper that was quite famous in around, I think it was 2014, give or take. It was maybe earlier, the Gillens and Page paper. They went on the Daily Show to talk about it. That determined that the U.S. was effectively an oligarchy. They went and they looked at all of the law and regulation that had been passed, and they asked the question of, okay, whose interests were directly served by these laws, and it was like, oh, the oligarchs, right? Is corporations, rich people. They were basically writing the laws and getting what they wanted, and everyone else, their preferences weren't as represented. It was like the U.S. was functionally an oligarchy, was the takeaway. That's a great way to alienate people and to drive them into the arms of fascists, right? Because you provokes this reaction, and especially when those fascists are willing to do dangerous culture war politics and all that kind of nonsense,
Yeah,
right?
and we can't keep our eyes off the prize here. We're an extractionary settler colonial project where 87 families, many of them multi-generationally wealthy, have more wealth than at least the bottom third of the country, if not close to half of the country. There has been a kind of cartel takeover of our housing market, our banks, our telecom, our food, all the necessities of life. When you break down like how strange it is that we have a cost of living, it's because they literally want to commodify every aspect of our life, and they'd be happy to pollute and even probably commodify the air if they could. That's kind of where we're at, and people are rightly enraged by that. They're working harder than they ever have in previous generations and getting less. Their money is being eroded by inflation, but is not an inflation that's led by government spending in vital programs and services like healthcare and education and housing. No, it's an inflation that's driven almost solely by profiteering, and I would argue collusion, and in some cases price fixing. Um, so we like to look down our nose at how bad things get in the states, but when it comes to anti-competition laws and when it comes to actually breaking up these cartels, we've been very weak because liberals and conservatives are happy to go hat in hand and say, please, will you give some relief to the working poor, right? And that's where I think the NDP comes in. That's where we have to continue to put that pressure on to expose our own homegrown oligarchies and demand better for Canadians.
Let's dig into that. I want to dig into inflation and groceries, because I think the inflation conversation has been such a mess over the last couple of years. You've got some on the right saying, well, it's all the carbon tax, and then academics saying we can account for the effect of the carbon tax on it's minuscule on a lot of these things. There's a little bit of that. Then there was denial that any of it had to do with collusion or a lack of competition in the market. And then we learned from some economists, no, there was definitely corporate side inflation sneaking things in up above the what the rate otherwise would have been. And then of course there were major external concerns, right? Pandemic, supply chain issues, Russia's war in Ukraine, climate change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it got really, really complicated. And then the debate just broke down. It was just like bad faith attacks from the conservatives and the liberals pretending it wasn't anything they could control, and so on and so forth. Like, it was a whole mess. Now we get to this point where we're facing an economic crisis, this prolonged affordability crisis. We've got to do something about it. The NDP is proposing removing GST from some items and a price cap on groceries. The GST thing removal makes a lot of sense to me. I'm less sure how the price cap works. Is that viable? Can you explain how that works?
Well, from my perspective, I think that we do have levers when it comes to corporate tax rates. And if you're going back to the conversation of inflation, you referenced Russia and Ukraine, you referenced COVID. If all of those things were true and the input costs rose and the price or the profit margins stayed the same, then in theory, they would have less profit. But that's not what happened. They actually made record profit. And so that alone, like, you don't have to believe what I'm saying. You don't even have to believe what's being said online or in the media. You just have to go and listen to what they say at their earnings statements when they brag about record profits year after year. So even during COVID, when the economy shut down, there's not a scenario that the biggest corporations, the oligarchs, the grocers should have been able to, in theory, make record profits. They should have had, there should have been a correlation between the rising costs and the fixed price with, if not losses, but at least similar profits. But record profits, they're telling on themselves. And so during the worst of it, while everybody's struggling to pay rent, pay for food, they're making off like bandits. From my perspective, we have within our levers of fair corporate taxation the ability to incentivize um, profit seeking, or I should say, limit profit seeking by incentivizing price caps. So, in other words, if they're insistent on having an ever inflating cost for baby formula, which right now in my city is locked up behind glass cases, like, think about that.
Yeah.
Think about how disgusting it is that a parent, a mother, a father, a guardian going to feed their child is driven to have to steal it because they don't have enough money to feed their kids. That's a problem. Those are choices. And so I do think that the government has within our powers the ability to intervene and plan in the economy through tax, I would say, compliance. Some might call it coercion on those essential items to make sure that they're affordable for people. And I would argue that going into the anti competition laws is another thing. Like, Giant Tiger, Loblaws, all of them were under investigation. We know that to be true for fixing the price of bread. If you look at the oil and gas sector, same thing. And while it is true the costs have dipped a little bit with carbon tax, I'm not naive enough to think that after this election, they won't go right back up to where they were before, so that the oil and gas sector can continue to both take massive subsidies from the public coffers and make massive private profits, which has always been the Ponzi scheme that we've been in as a country.
Let's dig into this a little bit more because I think one of the major complaints that I've seen on the left about the institutional left has been we don't do industrial policy anymore, or we don't do enough of it. And we skirt around talking about, okay, we need a little bit more regulation here, or we need to make an investment over here, or we're going to bring in a battery plant, whatever it might be. You're in Hamilton,
That's right.
you, working class, industrial, you're going to feel steel tariffs hard,
First,
right?
we
Uh,
already have layoffs at National Steel Car. We had Unifor in here with the auto sector folks. USW folks are feeling the pinch that are making parts in the auto sector. Even just the threat of tariffs have
mhm.
caused layoffs. Like, there's people now.
No one's investing, right? No one wants to.
No one wants to invest. There's too much uncertainty.
So, what does an industrial strategy look like that seizes this moment and says, "My God, we're going to go back to doing political economy. We're going to go back to doing industrial strategy," and saying, "You know what? No, free market fundamentalism that doesn't work because we have political goals that don't line up with abstract textbook economic explanations of how the world ought to work with a perfectly rational distribution of individuals and incentives." Like, what does a renewed industrial strategy look like?
Well, it looks like making sure that workers are at the table in a tripartite scenario for the planning, right? We need to ensure that the branch plant economy, because let's face it, NAFTA in the 90s in Hamilton was the gutting of our industrial core. All of these factories didn't go overseas, they went down south where there was lower wages, non-union, no environmental restraints, simply to maximize profits. We've watched that happen before. And in the 90s, with the liberals and conservatives, their plan for workers was employment agencies, job boards.
Yeah.
Go from steel and learn how to code. It was absurd. And we believe that when you have workers at the table for these discussions, planning things like immigration, understanding that if you're good enough to work here, you're good enough to stay, understanding that there should be a tie from your temporary foreign visa to a trade union instead of a company, so you're not in indentured servitude, would be a first step. And when it comes to an industrial strategy, there cannot be a bailout. There cannot be a bailout of any corporation in this country that doesn't have strict conditions, explicit public conditions on maintaining production and employment. We watched what happened when the liberal government under COVID handed out cash to the corporate sector, some of the biggest, most profitable companies, only to watch them lay people off anyways. And that's because they don't have the political will or the courage to actually make it conditional and to claw back or tax back any of the profiteering that happens on these programs. And so an example here is, we're trying to green our industrial economy here. The liberals made a huge announcement a couple years back. I think it was upwards of like $400 million. It was a lot of money that went to DeFasco, but there was no clear ties on production and employment. And in fact, Mattel, one of the owners of DeFasco, threw like a $60 million wedding for his daughter. So these are corporate CEOs who are in no way hurting, but the working class is. It's true they're making more steel, but with less workers because of automation. And, our supply chains have been so integrated with the states that we are absolutely relying on them. I'll give an example of Hamilton Specialty Bar. It's been here over 100 years. Bain Capital bought it under Mitt Romney, bankrupted it, took the book of business, sent it to the South. It's literally a scrapyard now. Now, in my vision of a more cooperative economy, right? Because there's never been a free market. Let's be clear about that. In my vision of a cooperative economy, workers should have the first right of refusal in bankruptcies. Workers should have their pensions and benefits protected first as creditors in bankruptcies and not as debt to the company. And I do think that we should have a massive shift towards what I call the cooperative economy, which has those who create the value, in other words, the workers, having more share in the profits. In Europe, for example, boards of big corporations include the unions by legislation, right? So if we have to drag the private sector kicking and screaming in order to protect the working class interests of Canadians, we'll do that. And an industrial strategy simply looks like not just buy Canadian, but buy Canadian owned,
Mhm.
right? That's a very important thing, is that the branch plant extractionary economy that's been set up here is at the whims of the United States of America and Wall Street. That's a problem for us. So let's be clear. Central economic planning has been happening in Canada forever, just not by the people and not by government. It's been happening by Bay Street as a proxy to Wall Street, and it's picked apart the best features of our natural resources, our skilled workforce. It's used exploitation of foreign workers when local workers don't seem to fit the bill, and all of that needs to stop. So, in summary, I know that's a lot. I think a lot about this. It's my critic role: labor, jobs, and workplace development. I think about the gig economy, right? So for me, having sectoral bargaining is very important.
Mhm.
Retail workers shouldn't have to organize shop by shop across the country. They should be organizing with the corporation, the unions, and the government present in a tripartite way that lifts the floor for workers so that they can work full time hours and have enough money to survive in this economy. Any business that's predicated on the exploitation of their workers working full time and still living in poverty does not have an ethical leg to stand on in my estimation.
I mean, I'd love to hear more about this during the election. One of the things I've noticed is that a lot of these discussions have been non-existent or sidelined during the election, in part because the media is obsessed with horse race coverage. I've been covering the debates for a couple of days. I think they're goofy, in need of desperate reform. And then
Let's
I
talk about
watched.
that scrum. Like, how
Well,
disgusting is that?
exactly, and it's not productive, right? I mean, even if far right outlets stumble on a question that's in the public interest, it's always framed as or approached as a kind of trip up, got you, social media engagement farming clip factory. And the debate itself as well, the French one, we're recording this just before the English one, so we don't know what's happened. But in the French one was like fine by these debate standards, but there's no time to get into it. Jagmeet Singh, too. I'm about as big a critic of Jagmeet Singh as there is on the left. I watched in the debate. I thought he was quite strong. He's trying to get in a point on healthcare. There's no substantive discussion of healthcare. He's cut off for trying to do it. He raises a point about Gaza. He calls it a genocide, asks Mark Carney, do you think it's a genocide? Carney gives a kind of evasive answer. It's 20 seconds, and then we move on to talk about flags for a second. There's like a video about flags that comes up next. And I'm thinking, there's a big part of the debate that we need to have right there that hasn't happened. And we let it go. And I think that captures, and then the next day everyone talks about who landed the knockout punch, who
Right.
didn't get too bloodied. We talk about it like a boxing match. I'm like, does anyone remember the policies that we talked about? Because those are kind of important. And so I'm curious from your perspective as a candidate, what you feel is being missed substantively, issues I'm talking at the national level, and what you're hearing at the local level.
Yeah, I think people are, rightly worried. They're concerned about their future fate of the economy. We watched, particularly retirees, those that had investments, lose massive amounts of money almost overnight. The prospect of companies going bankrupt and then bankrupting pensions and benefits is always front of mind here in Hamilton. And so affordability, working class issues, and again, 90% of the country's working class, uh, weren't substantively debated because I think that there's a consensus between liberals and conservatives to keep it off the table because that would require them taking responsibility for where we're at. And so I think one of the things that's pushed so many people to this far right rage is the liberal elite veneer that it's never been so good. They do actually say that in the House of Commons. You have conservatives who take the worst parts of capitalism, the worst parts, homelessness, food costs, food banks, poverty, and they blame the government and they call it socialism. They call it so it's absurd. And then you have the liberal government who say it's never been so well and they blame workers. And people say, well, that's harsh, Matt. What do you mean they blame workers? Well, they created a ministry called the Ministry of the Middle Class, and they couldn't stop there. They added this line, which is very important. And those working hard to join them, somehow, that if you're low earning or if you're in the lower income class, it's the liberal position. It's been their position for the last 10 years. You're just not working hard enough. Both of those are false. People intuitively know the economy is rigged for the ultra wealthy. They're pissed. They want answers. The conservative answer is blame the newcomer, blame the trans kid, use the culture war for division. The liberals, they love it. It's symbiotic. They need the culture war too to use fear in order to say things can get worse if you vote for that guy rather than us. And you know who wins? David, you know who wins? Bay Street wins. Because they don't give a shit who's in power, whether it's going to be Carney, or Polyev, because they're both going to be pulled by the same strings.
It brings me to strategic voting, which is what I want to close on. It drives me kind of batty. Uh, it often doesn't work. Even people who are well-meaning and try to do it, it's hard to pull off. We've learned this lesson time and time and time again, and it's premised on this, as you said, this binary of and we know this from the data. People are telling pollsters and others this thing. I don't want Polyev to win, even though I might like the NDP, so I've got to vote for Mark Carney. And we go to the two-party system that you mentioned earlier. Uh, how do you respond to people say, look, I would love to vote NDP, but I got to make the strategic choice and back the liberals?
Yeah, there's a couple things here. It's definitely strategic. It's a liberal strategy to always present that they are the lesser of two evils. It's a bit of a liberal psyop. And yes, I know that there's modeling, national modeling, and then they use local formulas without any riding level, right? So in my situation, nobody's pulled Hamilton Center. How do they know? I know. I'm at the doors. I know what I'm hearing. But to lump us in with Flamborough and the rural areas and the suburban areas does not tell the story. And it's dangerous. And here's why. Because within the first 48 hours, there was a presupposition about the outcome. Decisions were locked in. What that does, and liberals, big L, small L liberals, those who, proclaim to be neutral, I've always voted NDP, but this time I'm voting for the Goldman Sachs banker. What it does is it actually argues that elections don't matter. In my mind, it diminishes our entire democratic institution of elections because I happen to think elections do matter. I think that ideas should be challenged. I do not believe in the coronation of anybody. And I don't believe that anybody is beyond critique. But yet, there were people within the first 48 hours who said, now's not the time, NDP, sit this out. Now, mind you, they're liberals, right? We've seen this time and time again. They use this, they drag it out, and they use how deplorable and unpopular and distasteful far right politics are, and they are all those things. But again, they use the logic that we have to reduce our democracy to two parties in order to avoid the outcome of a so-called democracy in the States that has two parties. That's not Canada. One of the defining features of Canada is the diversity of representation from coast to coast to coast that is manifested in parties. And is party politics problematic? Yeah, there's some democratic deficits there as well, but it definitely works better when there's more than two voices. And I would argue that well first past the post, it doesn't actually require you getting the majority of the votes. It just requires you getting more than the next person. And what we know to be true, at least from my estimation, is that's like 8% that they're trying to attract, right? And that's
Mhm.
what incentivizes the culture war. So all the stuff, that's cooked up, whether it's on, gun laws, religion, niqab, trans gender expression and identity, trans kids, what have you. That culture war is a unique distraction to pit people against each other to simply move 8% of the vote. They don't care where they get the
Yeah.
8% of the vote from.
Yeah.
Now, imagine a system where we can like debate ideas and think about a compelling alternative for the future of the country and agree sometimes with the opposition parties and work together and cooperate where it makes sense. I happen to think that's the compelling vision for the future of the House of Commons, not a two-party system that flops between supermajorities that ultimately never actually address the material conditions for Canadians. So again, you do not have to be afraid in your ridings to vote for the party that speaks to you in a meaningful way. It is true that you can have a preferred prime ministerial candidate, but they're not actually on your ballot because this isn't presidential. You have a civic duty to look at your local candidates and decide for yourself, is this the person that I want representing my interest in Ottawa? Because the parliamentary system is more than just the prime minister. As
Mhm.
powerful as they are, there's committees, there's debates, there's all types of things that happen outside the PMO's office that the PMO can't control. We know that. How? Well, look at Trudeau and the demise of his reign. So, in summary, I believe elections matter. I believe our democracy is important and I believe it's fragile. And we cannot be scared into reducing our options to Coke or Pepsi.
In the uh, which? I think thought experiment. Are the liberals Coke or Pepsi? The liberals are Coke, right? Because they're the ubiquitous one.
Well, and they're red. I mean, there's a little play on that too.
I last little bit before we close out. Is there any issue or issues in particular that you feel we haven't discussed in this election that we need to highlight? For me, it's Gaza. Uh, Again, obviously, that doesn't come up in the debates. Not really. I mean, national defense didn't even come up in the French language debate. I don't know about the English one yet. Uh, because again, it's easy to get caught up in Trump and tariffs because they're very, very important. But there's other things going on. Anything stand out to you?
I mean, absolutely. If for an entire generation, what's happening in Gaza in the West Bank is a moral compass question. Our foreign policy is a reflection of our internal domestic values. And if we want to have sovereignty as a country, we must break free of being foreign policy lapdogs for the United States of America. That we should be able to stand on our own moral fortitude and speak out against genocide, not just in Palestine, but in Congo, right? In Sudan, foreign interference in what's happening in Haiti, all around the world. We need to reflect. Like, I have been in global summits where the reflection of the West is 12% of the population. You can go into a room and literally see how small we are as the West vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And yet, when it comes to the death and destruction and the wars, we seem to be at the center of it. I believe that the aspiration of Canada is to be an honest broker of peace and diplomacy. I believe in diplomacy. I don't believe that you even have to have a strong interest on the local populations. You don't have to pick sides to call for a ceasefire. You don't have to pick sides to call for an end to a genocide or a brutal apartheid occupation. And people can set that aside all they want. They can downplay it, as Mark Carney did. I believe his non-answer is very much an answer. I believe that the person he picked as a chief of staff is very much a reflection of what his foreign policy values are there, given what that person has called for in the past and the people that that person has platformed in the past. And as a New Democrat, we come from a long line of anti-war activism that calls for Canada to a higher position in the world. Like, I believe that Canada's position in the world has been diminished because we're refusing to take principled positions at the UN. We're refusing to provide the kind of humanitarian support. And most importantly, we're continuing to supply weapons to a country that's under investigation for genocide. That's not only immoral, it's against international law and makes us complicit in the genocide. So those are very important questions that very few leaders, aside from Jagmeet, who's taken a very strong position, and Pierre Poilievre, who has also taken a
Yeah.
very strong position. In fact, calling for the deportation and the suspension of civil liberties in Canada to simply kick people out of the country for whom he doesn't agree with. You only have to look to the States to see what that slippery slope looks like for the decline of democracy. That's a very important thing that Canadians should be paying attention to. And they need to know that having New Democrats in the House who are unafraid to speak that truth to power and to stand up for civil liberties is going to be an important aspect of the next composition of the House of Commons.
Well, that's, I think, a very powerful and important note on which to end it. So I'll end it there with my thank you to you for joining today, and wish you. I don't think I'm going to portray too much of a bias here that isn't already known, but wish you all the best on the doorsteps and at the ballot box on the 28th.
Thank you. We're working incredibly hard. So this is what democracy looks like. I do encourage people to get out and vote. If they get to the advanced polls, do that. Vote your conscience. Vote for who aligns with your values. I'm not even saying vote for me or vote for us. Just go do your thing. The
I think
country
people.
depends on it.
I think people should vote for you. I can say that with that. But thanks again, and to everyone listening, thank you so much, and we'll see you back here next time.